Greetings, everyone. Welcome to our exclusive Global Leading Voices webinar campaign. We are delighted to have you join us here today. Please be informed that if you have any questions during the presentation, you may type them into the question box in your control panel. The presenter will answer your questions at the end of the presentation accordingly. Now, without further ado, we will turn the time over to our presenter, who will begin shortly.
Good day, everyone, and welcome to this PECB webinar on the importance of ISO 22316 on the Brexit phenomenon for the UK and non-UK citizens. My name's John Robinson. I'm the Managing Director of Inoni Limited, and it's a subject matter that has been our focus for some time now, probably around a year since the draft was published. I found it a very interesting and sometimes challenging subject to get my head around. So when the final version was published, or the latest version, I paid my £80 and downloaded it. And I read through, and at first I felt maybe it didn't offer very much. A long title, but just 10 pages of dry and sometimes quite heavily engineered clauses. My thinking was that surely there must be good value in there if only I can unlock it. And so I decided to apply a test, my own test, perhaps a little unconventional, but relevant for many, and I chose Brexit. I wrote a paper about it, and that's on our website. Briefly, my perspective was that Brexit is not just there to be enjoyed by the British. It is an international phenomenon, so I think it's of interest to many different groups, whether you think about it neutrally or whether you have an organizational perspective on it. So wherever you are, whether you're a public body, a charity, a small business, there's a very good chance that the 22316 standard can help you to deal potentially with the effects of Brexit. That was my premise. So, but before I do that, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about who I am and what I do. I have a Master's of Science in Control Electronics and also General Systems Theory. I'm also a Fellow of the Business Continuity Institute. I'm Inoni's Managing Director and have been since it was founded in 2005. But I've actually worked in business continuity and IT disaster recovery since around 1991. So a long career covering many different areas. The idea of resilience came to my notice actually much before this, back in 2002. I was given the subject to speak on creating a resilient culture at a conference, and I had no idea what it was, but accepted the assignment, but then got offered a training session to give to about 20 paying participants, and I thought I should benchmark their resilience. And only once I committed to doing this did I think carefully about just how difficult it would be to do it. What I did was to break it down into different attributes, characteristics, whatever you want to call them, key performance indicators, and then measure their attainment on each one. And that has remarkable parallels with what you're about to see in this presentation, this webinar. It went on because I benchmarked resilience. The UK Financial Services Agency, the FSA, also wanted to benchmark resilience in the finance sector in the UK, covering the top 80 organisations. And they asked if we would actually do that work. And from that, our software grew, and from that, we generally worked in resilience and since that time. So quite a long progression, really. And for that work, I actually got the BCI's Lifetime Achievement Award, which was good. Other papers at the bottom, you can find those on our website: Geopolitical Continuity Planning, Robotics and Resilience in Manufacturing, and also this one, A Resilient Approach to Brexit, which you might like to go and have a look at. The company Inoni was formed when some of those banks involved in the resilience benchmarking project asked if we could extend its scope to provide business continuity tools. So what we do now is provide consulting and software. Generally, it's consultancy backed by the tools that we built, which are very adaptable. A lot of it is to do with resilience-related metrics, so capability maturity modeling rather than straightforward compliance. It's a little bit more in depth than that. And we have some large organizations right the way down through to small businesses as customers, and we do a lot with the insurance industry, obviously to build resilience into their customers, reduce the level of claims and so on. So we really do enjoy finding new ways of doing this, but I guess one of our main drivers is doing it very economically and very practically. So we focus on getting a result that works for our customers. So on to ISO 22316. So I should explain where I'm coming from with this webinar. Specifically, so I picked Brexit because it's a very challenging subject that will affect all kinds of different organizations. But I wanted to use it to tease out the values of 22316, as I said in my prior introduction. So this is going to be double facing in some ways. It definitely will have some relevance for Brexit, but my main aim is to get the value out of 22316, to extract it and make it accessible to you and anyone else that watches this webinar. So the first little point on this slide says what people think. Now, if you search the internet and you type in, what do people think of ISO 22316? What you see is a long list of people saying, you need to do this, it's great, and so on and so on and so on. Occasionally, I go and speak to people, professionals, about it. And I think we all agree it's a great thing, but it's very hard to get your teeth into the standard, to understand how to pick it up and apply it for an organization. And again, I actually feel I preferred the more pragmatic approach, as I first saw it, of BS 65000. But I'll explain why my view has changed. So the reason I chose Brexit specifically was that it's multifaceted, it's systemic, it crosses all boundaries, all types of organization. It affects people around the world. It's enduring, it lasts a long time, and it's a changing situation. And for many organizations, it's a very complex risk that they really can't seem to address comfortably. Obviously, it carries the possibilities of both losses and opportunities that could be felt by each of us at different times. So it's a kind of a moving feast or famine, and somehow we ought to find a mechanism to manage it. So I think people's thoughts about it are still ambivalent about the standard. People's thoughts about Brexit are equally flaky, I think. One of the most, I should say, what it says about resilience. So there's these two clauses in here that tell you something. It says it provides guidance to enhance organizational resilience for any type or size of organization. So it's non-specific and it can be applied permanently. So it should work for the problem that I'm talking about. And then it says it does not promote uniformity in approach across all organizations. Specific objectives and initiatives are tailored to suit an individual organization's needs. So in other words, not only is it generic and has to fit small to large organizations equally well, it also doesn't offer a single approach, which means you have to find your own approach from within the standard. And that's where it becomes difficult. That's where the conflict potentially exists. It does get itself out of it later. It also it explains what it means to be resilient. So in terms of what we should expect, we should come out of this with the ability to preserve the delivery of our strategic objectives by anticipating and responding, absorbing shock and adapting to change. Well, I would hope it would tell us how to do that. It then goes on to suggest, bizarrely in my view, but there we go, There is no absolute measure of resilience or definitive goal, but it's possible to become more or less resilient. When I say bizarrely, what I actually mean is I should be able to say how resilient an organization is. It should be possible to provide an index, provided you can find a way of measuring something that everyone agrees on. And there are ways of doing this in terms of scenarios and finding out the percentage, for example, of your EBITDA, your earnings before profit deductions and adjustments, what the proportions are. That may give you some sort of objective. I won't go there. But what should we expect from a standard like this? I think you have to go and look back at what standards are there to achieve. Do you expect it to be a design spec for you? Because if you do, I think you're going to be disappointed. If you think it's going to be a post-implementation audit check, then I think you'll find it a lot more useful insofar as it doesn't try to do as much. It creates a shape that you can drop over your organization and say, yeah, we passed on these pieces and we need to improve on these other pieces. I think that's the expectation you should set. I don't think you should use it necessarily as a design framework, because I don't think it'll work. I think you'll be disappointed. So that's the place to start. It's not a completely, it's not a solution in a box. It won't work that way. So just another quick look at Brexit. Last week or a couple of weeks ago, I spent some time with a very large fruit and flower packer and distributor, a big organization here in the UK, and we were developing an impact model for their business to understand, for business continuity, understand how pain would affect them, how fast it would affect them, and so on. And we did a threat assessment, a horizon scan, and we brought up Brexit and thought it would be an absolute focus for them. And it wasn't. It was hardly discussed. And this kind of threw me slightly because I would think it would be something that they were worried about, largely because much of their workforce is from Europe, much of their produce is from Europe, some of their, well, most of their delivery is to UK organizations who also have interests in Europe. So I think they didn't discuss it because of the uncertainty it brings. It is kind of the elephant in the room that no one talks about, delaying decisions and investment, but it really does represent an intense risk for them. It has the possibility of driving away the super flexible, skilled, willing workforce, many of whom are from Eastern Europe, from this very seasonal business that I think they're going to find it very difficult to replace. If you add that to the sensitivity of the customer base, the supermarkets, who will wait no time if something goes wrong. They're so intolerant, you can't afford to have a breach like this. So what you find is exposure for them can arise, and for most of us, in two ways. The supply side, I've just mentioned, is perhaps very obvious, but demand is equally fragile. If you take two near identical firms serving near identical large customers, except one decides to relocate, one of the customers decides to relocate to Frankfurt and seek a local provider, well, one of those firms will potentially fail and the other will pick up its local business. So you could see two almost identical organizations, one being a complete beneficiary and the other disappearing just because of who their customers are. Obviously, the same goes for the supply side. If the cost of supply increases or disappears, then you're faced with new problems and you stop being as competitive as you were. Brexit's also a systemic disruptor. In other words, it affects things like currencies, it affects interest rates, socio-political conditions, property values. It is truly geopolitical. The whole environment changes, and from my point of view, the risk environment changes, which makes this something of extreme interest for me. So I think it's a very valid test of resilience. If I'm going to test this standard, Brexit is an ideal thing to shoot at it because it will challenge it fully. So let's take a quick look at it and see how it might help. So by tackling this very difficult challenge, we have the opportunity to learn and perhaps take some serious value from it. When you open ISO 22316, you can see that it's got three main sections, maybe a fourth as well that you would look at. The first is called principles. It gives you a foundation. These are kind of the main KPI, the key performance indicators, that the things that you should do and that you're trying to maximize to become resilient. It then expands those in terms of 9 attributes. And these are the characteristics of an organization that allow those principles to be adopted fully. So it describes what you need to do to become resilient. Then it identifies activities, which are the acts you must take to deploy those attributes, to optimize them, to make them happen. It's an interesting thing. If I show you the picture, so this is just a representation that I've chosen. I also chose a single keyword for each one. They're my choices, they're not ISO's. The ISO heading is underneath each one, and you can see objective, shared vision, and clear purpose. And we'll go through all these individually in a moment, just to explain how they work. But as you look at those, you'll be thinking, well, particularly anyone who's watching that's familiar with ISO 22301 for business continuity. It was one of the first to adopt the Plan, Do, Check, Act. It's called the Deming model, which is a management system that overlays business continuity. And crudely, what it says is, take these steps to get it in good shape, and then use this cycle to keep it in good shape. And here are some other good things that you can do around it. And what it is a management system. It's a very well specified management system, and it is the driver of that discipline. This is very similar, but better. Almost every clause, when you go and read the document, represents what most of us would think of as good management. There's an interesting spin on it though, and we'll come to it shortly. One of these, the bottom one in the middle, integrated, the coordination of disciplines, offers something quite special that isn't obvious when you look at this initial picture. There are 20 or so related disciplines, and if you think of this as being just a management structure, those disciplines are what give it substance. So if you were trying to represent this as a resilient picture, as it stands, it interlocks, it looks as if it's solid, but you could slide things apart. If you created a grid of disciplines that joined it together, like the reinforcing rods in a reinforced concrete floor, for example, it will become solid. It will become very firm, it would have no holes, and it will be a powerful, useful platform for the organization. That's where this is headed. So that is the first kind of learning point that I took when I was doing this. I looked at this, thought, that's just a management system. Eventually I read through to the other piece and I thought, okay, I understand it now, but it's not obvious when you read the document. We'll touch on this again and again as I talk. So that's why it works. The point is we need to now apply this for Brexit. So looking at the first of them, I'm going to go through these fairly sharpish because we don't have a lot of time and there's quite a bit I need to say. The first attribute, shared vision and clarity of purpose. When you read it in the ISO standard, it's generic. There's nothing in it. I think the word resilience is mentioned in the first paragraph. The rest of it's generic. In fact, I probably wouldn't start on this slide if it wasn't for the fact it's numbered 1. I'd start on the next slide, but I'll show you. What this means is you need to have a communications platform. You need to have, what it tells you is you need certainly for Brexit, I would have a policy and a mission statement. I'd say how we're going to deal with it. I'd then have a communications plan. I'd have a project office and a program terms of reference. And those things I would use to communicate, to develop and communicate this sense of purpose. Now, you'll find different organizations for Brexit. Well, some will treat it as just a nuisance. It won't be anything other than a distraction, something that appears in the news, right the way through to others that it will be potentially the survival or the end of their business, how they actually deal with it. So to start with shared vision and clarity of purpose, you need to know where you're going. What ISO says is that the alignment of your resilience program with your organizational decision, your organization strategy and purpose is fundamental, and it's something that you should have. So if I did it for Brexit, I would then probably be able to extend it quite easily to the whole of resilience management. So instead of just having it for Brexit, I would create a policy and a mission statement for managing resilience in the organization. I'd have a comms plan for resilience. I'd have a resilience project office. In fact, what I'm doing is I'm defining the external perception of our resilience program. And I think that's a useful thing to take from it. So I would certainly do that as part of the picture. I think the second slide is the most important here, because I said that the set of 20 disciplines was vital, but it's there. What I think is missing is any material under this understanding and influencing context. The reason I think it's missing is there is no definition for context in the standard. It assumes you know what it means. What it actually means is everything that is of interest to you that could affect you, every dependency within and external to your organization, every environment, it's anything that has meaning for you. And what that does is it defines the set of external influences that, in this case, Brexit could come to bring to bear on your organization. So if, for example, I don't know, a trade tariff is reduced or increased, or if a particular exporter decides not to export to your country because of this, that would be modeled somehow in the context picture that you keep. So for me, this context model that I've sort of alluded to is the essence of any resilience activity. It is the subject. It's you have the organization as a whole, but you can't see it all in a picture. This is something that we do as part of our business continuity methodology, which touches a lot on resilience. It is a resilience builder, but we've used it for many years, and we actually build an elastic dependency model, a layered model that goes from stakeholders through products and services, processes, down through the production process, infrastructure, supply chain. And we have this map that we populate with objects, risk objects that are in the business. We join them up with dependencies, we quantify them, and we use them as a means of simulating threats to the business. So we can fire a threat at an area or an object, and we can see how its effect ripples through the organization, and we can then quantify it. Well, Brexit will be the same. So in other words, if I model the supply chain and see how the supply chain feeds into the business, and I take out 10% of those suppliers and have to replace them, I can see immediately the effect that I need to deal with. So I would be emphatic about this. I think in addition to these 9 attributes and the 20 disciplines, I would add to the recipe a very clear context model that you can actually work with that represents your organization. The other 2 pieces don't represent your organization. They have no subjectivity. They're up to you. This piece is you. This is absolutely your picture of the business that you can work with. So the 3 points I've made there, find a way to model Brexit climate and effects. That's the threat profile that Brexit offers. Understand the threat gap and impact profiles. Threats are what it comes with. The gaps are gaps in your defenses, but also gaps in the way you implement things. So if you have redundant networks, if you have resiliency built into the way your products are delivered, are there any gaps there? You also need to know where the impact comes from. You need to know how to prioritize when the chips are down. When you can see things are happening and you have a choice, you have to make the right choice. This model will enable you to do all those things. It is the basis for business impact analysis. From the same model, you can then start to simulate. When you can simulate, you can start to simulate the remedial actions or the resilience building tactics that you're going to build into that model. So the same model becomes your target for continuous improvement, which we'll come on to later. So for me, it's a crucial additional dimension that is not within ISO 22316. So again, I would make a note of this. The amazing thing is it's the same model. If you do it for Brexit, you have it for the whole business. You have it for all of resilience. So it's a big win to do this and every other risk that you face. This is an interesting one. A lovely picture from a little while ago when it was very, very friendly, and it still is friendly. What I would say is resilience, it's talking about effective and empowered leadership for resilience. Well, I'm looking at Brexit. So resilience is, or at least should be, a steady state condition. It's something that you have. If it could have a number, it will be a stable number that represented how tough you were, how able you were to bounce back from disruption or anything that would disturb the normal business flow. So my question is, if it's a steady state condition, does it need specialized leadership or just management and a sponsor? If it is stable, it should be enough to have management and a sponsor like any other program in the business. Well, if that's so, how do you then reconcile that with the 20-odd disciplines that I talked about, and where you're going to find many of those responsibilities are split between many heads and sponsors? And it sounds like it needs, to me, it needs a process lead, something out to the side that is actually activity independent, possibly a quality director. I actually worked with a governance, risk and compliance director who was responsible for all of those disciplines on a matrix basis, and that seemed to work well. So you then come to Brexit. Do you assign Brexit responsibility to an executive, or do you delegate it? How far down do you push it, and how long for? Is it just while things are peaceful, and does it change? And I think it depends. I think for many organizations, Brexit's a side issue unless things become difficult, and you won't know when they're going to, in which case you may find you need different sets of skills. Reverting back to my business continuity specialism, you can look at some kinds of events and they're treated only as an incident. They get managed and absorbed at shop floor level. They're just an operational inconvenience where you have to source something from somewhere else. The next level up is emergencies. These are things that are a disturbance, but they're a short-term disturbance for which there is a corrective measure, but it requires a special act, a special designation of person to do it, someone with authority to make that happen. But even so, it's a short-term disruption. Then you have potentially a crisis. Crisis management's possibly overstating it, but that will be the case for some organizations facing Brexit. There will be rulings that come out of the decision-making process that absolutely floor the organization. It will give them a problem that they don't know how to deal with, in which case you're probably going to need to escalate. So what this says to me is that, in fact, what you need in the organization for resilience is a very clear hierarchy. And it might actually be that it should be linked to a continuity hierarchy, simply because you have this possibility of when resilience does go wrong, or when resilience fails to defend and when need to recover, you still need to switch into that mode. And it should be seamless and smooth, and everyone should know how to do it. And it probably means that people will need to have this defined, and you'll need to practice. So Culture is number 4. So for me, culture is the ultimate enabler or the biggest obstacle. If you have a culture that is welcoming to whatever it is you're trying to achieve, it's easy. People buy into it, and it's like they're taking it from you, and it's a very easy thing to do. If it's the other way around and the culture's resisting, they don't want to go in the direction you're pushing them, almost nothing will make them do it. If you do, it's going to be a long time before it actually, it's a long time before you see real results, typically years. To change cultural behavior is a long-term activity. It's a slow-moving beast, as I said in my paper. So for Brexit, that's quite tricky, because potentially we don't have years in which to change the way people do things. We want whatever changes that we may need to make, they need to be brought online sometimes relatively quickly. And it would be good if we could find ways, rather than change the culture to deliver them, to actually find parts of the culture that we can target to make things easier. So I know just how difficult this can be. And my conclusion really is you need to start with what you've got, because you may not have time to change the way people are. And in fact, when you look back at the way Brexit in the UK certainly happened, there were divisions between families, let alone work colleagues, in what was the right way to do things. And I think they're still there. I think there's still antipathy there, and therefore it's a difficult subject matter. So you're left with this possibility of working with the behaviors that you see amongst the workforce that will help. And those are typically things like incentive, reward, growth of the organization, all the positives that you think of that people can't dispute. And then taking in any of the supportive influences, so perhaps the way your customers are looking at it, take them along with you. But above all, when you find these things, make sure that you communicate them out to the whole workforce. And I think by doing that, you'll see it move faster, and you'll be able to make the changes easier. This number 5, the context model I described is built entirely from information. If you don't have the information, you can't put it in the model. If you don't build the model, you can't reason about your circumstances. So what you have to do is to go and collect that information from sources that are credible. If they're not credible, you end up populating it with bad information. All your decisions are fueled by the model, so therefore the quality of your decisions deteriorates. When you have all that information, you can empower decisions across the organization. And what's more, by having a single model, you end up with a consistent, self-consistent set of information. And based on what you have, some aspects of it will be futuristic, some from horizon scan type activities, which adds even another layer, because it allows you to do that magic word at the bottom in the middle, which is anticipate. So to analyze, anticipate, and act, you need a very high grade of information. So I guess the steps for Brexit particularly would be, well, build your network, which is almost certainly the entire supply chain, going up into your customers, down into your suppliers, but also sideways out into the community, into every environment that you're part of, any sphere of influence that you can interact with. That may involve local and regional and national government. It may include trade bodies. Your sources of information, anything that you can find out and combine and draw conclusions from, you should. You then create the framework. We talked about it. You analyze it. You modify it. So as new information comes in, you change the framework that you work with. You're then in a position to replay those scenarios. So we didn't really talk about the scenarios for Brexit, but if at any time you look at the model and you can see that a particular set of threats are headed your way, you model that scenario and you find out what the possible outcomes are, and you build resilience to it and solutions for it. So this will allow you to just keep them informed, and you can then adjust your strategies to deal with them. Number 6 is to do with resourcing. Now, oh, sorry, drop the mouse. to do with resourcing. And ISO refers here to the people, premises, technology, finance, and information that is in the system that you built. So if you have a resilience management system, it needs to have fuel. It needs to have things with which to build that resilience into the organization. And you can see when you look at it, the people example I gave you earlier about the workforce is an obvious one. They need an alternative source of people. So it's everything you need ultimately to close the gaps in the model, to adapt when things change, and to adapt in good time, because everything has a time frame, to reinforce it, to replicate, and so on. So your business strategy is a bit like a recipe in some ways. You need to look at what you need to do, and to do it, you're going to have a timeline. It's like a micro plan for Brexit, certainly. And it will tell you what resources you need. To look at resilience as a whole, you look at the whole model, and you look at its entire threat risk environment, and you make the model systematically more resilient. And we do this by working our way through the risk objects, looking at what threatens each one, looking at what it's worth, what the cost is of that, and what the impact is if it fails, either on its own or as part of a pattern. We can then look at our tolerance to loss and adjust the defense, the strength and the recoverability of each object. So while this on the one hand is about whole organization resilience, on the other, if you adopt the right modeling approach and the right thinking method, you can actually look at it on a more micro basis and look at individual things, subsystems of the system, and make them tougher as well. But there's a way of doing that in the feedback process. The kind of things that you can do to build resource resilience, stockpiling, diversification, replication, redundancy, alternate sourcing or multi-sourcing, globalization, or you can just stop doing some things. But the message at the end of the slide really is, this is a program with continuous demand. You will continuously need to change to keep pace with the outside world. Your resourcing will never stop. It needs a budget, it needs leadership, and you're trying to achieve a level and maintain a level of maturity through this. So this is the slide I talked about earlier. This is attribute 7, development, coordination and management disciplines. You can see it's an annex to the ISO standard, and it's specifically a long list of different standards that ISO supports, obviously, each of which may or may not have been taken on by your organization. So what BS 65,000 you used to talk about was this idea of coherence. In other words, all of these being joined up in a net that provides you with an overall set of disciplines that has very few holes. So in other words, if you did all this and you did them in a way that each one talked to the others, there will be no gaps and no overlaps. And I think that's what ISO 22316 offers. The management system allows you to tie all these together, whichever you do, however you do them, whether you do them to best practice or not, but it allows you to join them together and create a result that's got fewer holes and more consistency because of the way it's managed. So I think they're kind of like the reinforcing rods, as I said, in the reinforced concrete. I can actually see ISO eventually offering 22316 as the management system, and these as the specific content. I guess it might reduce certification overheads and conflicts, but I don't know. Is all of this overload, trying to take it all on? Possibly. I think, as I've written there may be implications for agility and bureaucracy. You could, if you're a small firm, try and take all these on formally, and you'd never achieve it. You just simply wouldn't have the resource to do them all justice, although you probably do them informally already. So I think we all do some of these, however formal or informal, and what we're saying is that they should be able to use the same control and delivery vehicle. Yeah. So these final two, there's this one supporting continual improvement, and the next one is ability to anticipate and manage change. I think the two are quite closely linked. I think what they mean by supporting continual improvement is really about performance management. So it's not change per se, although to improve continually, you must continually be making changes, otherwise you wouldn't be improving unless your threat environment was receding. So I think it's to do with proactive or opportunistic refinement, but it's systematic, and the aim is that you probably have a risk appetite, and if you overspend, you exceed, you come within your risk appetite. The perfect position is to exactly match your resilience with what is reflected by your risk appetite. If you spend too much, you're wasting money. If you spend too little or do too little, then the chances are you're exposed to too much risk. So there is a balance point, and it's like part of a control mechanism. So I viewed it as a feedback amplifier in a closed loop control system, and the better tuned it is for your organization, the more closely you can track your objective. The application of this for Brexit, well, it could help you survive because Brexit will change continually. So you need a really adaptive mechanism. You know, you have to be able to look at what faces you and see where you need to improve to keep actually on the track that you've set, to stay on your appetite. So I think having a monitoring capability where you know what to monitor, and it's possibly things within the context model that will allow you to maintain that level of defense. Last one, anticipate and manage change. I think this is a more operational sort of approach to change, but it's continuous in all the environments we operate in. So it affects us all the time. And the day you don't manage change and anticipate what's coming, you risk falling behind. And that's entropy. It's the tendency to disorder. And it will be, for example, a very brave IT manager that clung on to last year's antivirus software simply because things around you change. So this ability to do it, you can see all these different trade balances and things that you could see would change, particularly for Brexit. We have to manage those, and those are at a commercial level and an operational level and a supply chain level. It affects us throughout all of this. And this, I think what the ISO emphasizes is the need to anticipate and adapt. In other words, it's a very proactive change system that wraps into that previous performance management tool system. So that was a very quick run through these contributing factors. I mean, what do you think? Can you see how 22316 might work for your organization if you take those three views that I've suggested, this one of the attributes, the other of the disciplines, and the third one that isn't in there of the context model? I believe it actually builds a very strong framework that you need one of for an organization. You just do it once, not have lots of different disciplines that are doing it. Before I conclude, I've got a couple of more things I was going to show you. One is an example of a tool that we built just to measure. It's a maturity model. It measures maturity of the different attributes, and in this case there are actually 10. There's an additional one, monitoring, in there, and it shows how an organization changed its attainment of each of them. So this really is just looking at the ISO attainment and how good their management system is, the things they were doing. It's something that takes 10 minutes. You just rattle through it, a bunch of questions that look like this. You just make settings on the drop downs on about, I think it's about 10 pages like this. So very quick to do. If you'd like to do it, just drop me an email and I'll send you a link to the page. It's anonymous if you wish it to be anonymous. It also, you can do, we use it for organizations across different locations, so you can use it to monitor sort of composites, multi-site locations, and see which are falling behind. And we use the same sort of activity to measure compliance, we do benchmarking and so on. It's got expert systems in it, so it provides advice to the people that complete it. Okay, so I finished what I was going to say. Just a very brief conclusion. I think ISO 22316 is, I look at it, the more I look at it, the more I see a generic management system, and the less I see a resilience specific management system. I think it's an all-purpose tool that has been populated with this set of disciplines, and it gives you this framework. So from the day I first read it and felt perhaps a little disappointed, I'm now at a point where you can probably tell from the way I've spoken about it, where I can see real possibilities and I can see how to use it. But, there's a big but, you have to build it. It doesn't do it for you. You have to build your own resilience capability, and probably you have to build your own model to get the most out of it. And when you've got it, you need to keep it there. So it's not a static thing. If you leave it on its own, it'll be out of date in a month. If you keep working at it, and I think there are ways of setting up relatively small operations to make this happen, then I think you're in a much better position. And whether or not you think it can work for Brexit, I don't know. I think it will work in some circumstances. I think for a lot of organizations it will be overkill. For others, I think it'll be an absolute necessity to try to keep on top of something that is so complex and multifaceted. That's it. I'm done with my talking now, so I'd like to open it for discussion by you.
Thank you, John, for this.
PCB. Do you want me to move to the next slide, Erita?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Once again, thank you, John, for this great and very informative webinar. It was our honor to have you as a speaker at our Global Leading Voices webinar campaign. Before we continue with the question and answer session, I would like to inform all attendees that PCB provides training and certification services for ISO 22316 Foundation and ISO 22301 Introduction, Foundation, Lead Implementer, and Lead Auditor. These trainings are designed to provide you with the required knowledge on how to continue to operate effectively within a short period of time. A PCB certificate will demonstrate your dedication in implementing and managing these processes and frameworks, and most importantly, you will be recognized worldwide. For more information, please visit our website pcb.com/training. We will now proceed with the questions. The first question is, should resilience be a business priority?
Thanks, Erita. I think it probably, strangely, it already is, but no one labels it in the same way. I think it's a much better word than business continuity in many cases, simply because it, I don't know, it's newer and is more intuitive for people. I think most businesses already have resilience, otherwise they wouldn't be here, because they would fail as soon as anything ever went wrong. So should it be a business priority? Should it be on the board agenda? Probably not. Should it be something like IT, which is not, it doesn't go on the balance sheet, but it's there and it's viewed as something that is a necessary thing. It's like quality. It's something that is an attribute of the organization, and you can either have a very large focus on quality or a less focus on quality. And I think the same goes, and it will depend on the maturity of the organization and the demands of their customers as to how far up the organizational agenda the subject matter goes. So does quality appear on your board meetings? If it does, maybe this should, I don't know. Is that an adequate answer?
Thank you, John, for this answer. We will now proceed with the next question. How to assess a company's resilience?
I think that there's a section at the back of ISO 22316 that, if I just read it briefly, evaluating the factors that contribute to resilience. And it tells you that you should measure and monitor the factors. Really difficult thing to do. I personally, I mean, the example I showed you very briefly, I think this is one way of doing it. So if I give a real example, we have a financial organization that uses that same system. On the one hand, it has a model that measures compliance or maturity against, it's actually ISO 22301, and it looks at the measurable aspects in the standard and lets them score themselves on compliance, on alignment with it. Equally, on the flip side, they have a thing that we develop for them called a fitness test. So I have an auditable assessment, and then I have an actual practical operational evaluation, and it says some different things like, how long is it since your executive team underwent crisis management training? Is it a day? Is it 6 months, a year, 2 years, never? And as time moves on, you can see that if they aren't doing the progressive things, their scores start to go down. So I would say, how do you manage it? I would suggest doing something like that. As I said, you can have a go with this assessment tool, but I'd be very happy to talk to you about it anyway. But that's how I would do it. I would go and assess against the measurable attributes in the standard, but also you'd need to do it against the disciplines. So it's a big job.
Thank you, John. We will now proceed with the next question. How is resilience different from emergency preparedness?
Right. So emergencies tend to be, I work a lot on ports. So we have a great distinction between emergencies and business recovery, business threatening issues. Emergencies tend to be things that have an emergency plan, which is very prescriptive. It tends to tell people exactly what to do to close down the issue, to protect human life. And really it's a short-term containment activity. That said, every business continuity threat or problem or disruption starts with some kind of an incident or an emergency. So resilience is actually a property. It's a characteristic of an organization. So a rubber ball is more resilient than a glass one. So that's a property of the ball. Whereas an emergency plan is what you do when you drop the glass ball. You pick the pieces up and so on. So they're quite different. I mean, that's probably the best differentiating statement I can make, the analogy. That's it, Rita.
Thank you, John. The next question is, resilience is mainly known as a concept for individuals. How do you add the drivers of personal resilience to an organizational resilience concept like ISO?
Oh, wow. Yes, I guess so. I personally find, resilience, I've always associated it with systems because of my background. I suspect the questioner has come across this to do with people being tough under difficult situations, being able to come back from adversity and so on. I think it's almost, it's not exactly the same, it's different. One is, an organization is a system, and I use the example of a rubber ball, and I do think there's a great parallel between personal resilience and organizational resilience, because organizations are generally made of a number of people. So it's almost a collaborative version of personal resilience, but with a different purpose. So you're going to be resilient to different things with a view to optimizing another outcome. In other words, a business tries to optimize its success. Well, I guess a person tries to optimize their survival, make sure that they continue to live. So I think there is a parallel between them, but the purpose is different.
Because of the time limitation, we will now go with the last question. And the remaining ones will be answered live through email by John. So the last question is, who takes responsibilities for organizational resilience?
It's a very good question, and I touched on this when we were giving the presentation and the leadership slide. And for myself, I think it needs to be during normal business, just during peacetime, possibly the same person. But I would suggest someone like a governance, risk and compliance director or a quality director, someone who has oversight of the entire operational process, so that you can join up all of the individual disciplines that we talked about. You need to have oversight of everything, and it's a matrix position in some ways. So you have a finance director who has a vertical view. This particular type of role, if it is at a director level, and I think it should be a director level role, someone has it as one of their responsibilities, but not all of it. So it can be a minority responsibility, but they're responsible for the overall resilience of all aspects of the organization. I come across it in health and safety, quality, risk. Many different roles actually get to do this. Thank you very much.
Once again, thank you, John, for this excellent presentation, and I want to thank all the attendees as well who have joined us today. We hope you enjoyed this webinar. In the upcoming days, we will send you the recording link, which will be uploaded on our official YouTube channel and on our website, pcb.com. On behalf of PCB and John, thank you for joining us today and enjoy the rest of your day.